In September 1996, a payphone carried the last terrified words of 17-year-old Sarah Chen. "I know who it is." 28 years later, construction workers unearthed something beneath that same phone booth that would shatter a small town's carefully guarded secrets forever. Welcome back to another episode of Buried Secrets. I'm your host, and today we're traveling to Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town of just over 3,000 residents nestled in the Allegheny foothills. From the outside, it's the kind of place that appears in tourism brochures, complete with tree-lined streets, a quaint downtown square, and the sort of friendly neighbors who still wave from their front porches. But as we've learned time and again in this series, sometimes the most picturesque towns harbor the darkest secrets. Our story begins in 1996, when the world was a different place. The internet was still a novelty. Cell phones were the size of bricks and twice as expensive, and if you needed to make a call away from home, you found a payphone. In Millbrook, that payphone stood outside Murphy's gas station on Route 119, a lonely sentinel casting long shadows under the flickering neon sign. It was here, on a rain-soaked Saturday night in September, that 17-year-old Sarah Chen would make the most important phone call of her life. It would also be her last. To understand what happened that night, we need to understand Sarah. Born to David and Lynn Chen in 1979, she was what everyone in town called a good kid. Her father ran the only computer repair shop in Millbrook, while her mother worked as a nurse at the county hospital. Sarah was their only child, and by all accounts, she was everything parents could hope for: honor roll student, varsity soccer player, and the kind of teenager who still helped elderly neighbors carry their groceries. Sarah had this way about her, remembers Emma Rodriguez, Sarah's best friend since elementary school, speaking to us via video call from her home in Seattle. Even nearly 3 decades later, Emma's voice trembles when she talks about her childhood friend. She noticed things other people missed. She cared about people who felt invisible. Maybe that's what got her into trouble. Emma's words proved more prophetic than she could have imagined. In the weeks leading up to September 15, 1996, several people noticed changes in Sarah's behavior. Her coworkers at Millie's Diner, where she worked part-time, mentioned she'd become jumpy and distracted. Her soccer coach noted she'd been missing practices, claiming she didn't feel well. Most concerning of all, her parents observed that their normally chatty daughter had become withdrawn and secretive. "She used to tell us everything," David Chen told local news in 1996, his voice heavy with confusion and grief. But those last few weeks, it was like she was carrying some terrible burden she couldn't share with anyone. That burden would soon consume not just Sarah, but an entire community. The day of September 15th started normally enough. Sarah worked her Saturday shift at Millie's Diner, serving coffee and pie to the usual crowd of locals. But according to witness statements from that day, something was clearly troubling the teenager. Multiple customers mentioned that she seemed spooked and kept glancing toward the windows as if watching for someone. Maria Santos, the diner's owner, provided crucial testimony to investigators. Around 2 in the afternoon, Sarah got a phone call, Maria recalled. "I watched her face go white as she listened. She didn't say much. Just, 'I understand, and I'll be careful.' When she hung up, she asked if she could leave early. She looked terrified. Maria granted the request, but not before asking if Sarah needed help. The teenager's response would haunt Maria for years to come. Some secrets are too dangerous to share. What happened in the hours between Sarah leaving the diner at 2:30 p.m. and her frantic phone call at 9:47 p.m. remains a mystery. Her Honda Civic was later found to have logged an additional 47 miles that afternoon, though investigators could never determine where she'd driven. Gas station receipts and security footage from neighboring towns turned up no trace of her movements. What we do know is that at approximately 9:45 p.m., Sarah pulled into Murphy's gas station. The station's owner, Bill Murphy, was working alone that night and remembered seeing her car in the parking lot, though he was busy with other customers and didn't pay much attention. The station's security camera, which should have captured everything, mysteriously malfunctioned between 9:30 and 10:15 p.m. that evening. a technical failure that investigators would later find deeply suspicious. At exactly 9:47 p.m., according to phone company records, a call was placed from the payphone outside Murphy's station to Emma Rodriguez's home number. The call lasted 3 minutes and 27 seconds, but those brief moments would become the most analyzed conversation in Millbrook's history. Emma was in her bedroom doing homework when the phone rang. "I almost didn't answer," she admits. "It was late for a Saturday, and I had a chemistry test Monday I was stressing about, but something made me pick up." The voice on the other end was barely recognizable as her best friend's. Thank God you're there," Sarah whispered, her words rushed and breathless. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I think I'm in serious trouble." Emma could hear the fear in Sarah's voice, but also something else, a determination that seemed at odds with the terror. "Sarah, where are you? What's wrong?" "I'm at Murphy's station, but I can't stay here long. I've been followed all day. There's a car across the street right now, just sitting there watching me, a dark sedan with a broken headlight on the driver's side." "Maybe you should call the police," Emma suggested. But Sarah's response was immediate and firm. No police. I need you to understand something. If anything happens to me tonight, you need to know that it wasn't random. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. I know about things that certain people in this town would kill to keep secret. The desperation in Sarah's voice sent chills through Emma. "What kind of things? Sarah, you're scaring me. There are people in this town who aren't who they pretend to be. Important people. Respected people. And they know that I know." Sarah's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The sheriff's department, it goes all the way to the line went dead." Emma frantically tried calling back, but the payphone rang endlessly into the void. Something terrible had just happened to her best friend, and 28 years later, we're finally beginning to understand exactly what that was. But Sarah Chen's story doesn't end with that phone call. In many ways, it's just the beginning of a mystery that would consume a town, destroy families, and ultimately reveal that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones wearing badges of authority. The truth about what happened to Sarah Chen has been buried for 28 years. But as we'll discover, some secrets refuse to stay hidden forever. Emma Rodriguez hung up the phone in her bedroom at 9:50 p.m., her hands shaking. She immediately tried calling the payphone back, but it rang endlessly with no answer. Something in Sarah's voice, the raw terror mixed with desperate urgency, told Emma this wasn't one of her friend's occasional dramatic moments. This was real. "I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, paralyzed," Emma recalls during our interview. "Sarah had said not to call the police, but what else could I do?" She was clearly in danger. At 9:52 p.m., Emma dialed 911. The call was answered by dispatch operator Janet Morrison, a woman who had lived in Millbrook her entire life and knew every family in town. The 911 recording, which we've obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, captures the growing panic in Emma's voice as she tried to explain the situation. 911, what's your emergency? Hi, this is Emma Rodriguez. I just got a really scary phone call from my friend Sarah Chen. She says someone's following her and she's afraid something bad is going to happen. Where is Sarah now? She called from the payphone at Murphy's gas station on Route 109. The call got cut off, and now she's not answering when I call back. There's a pause in the recording, just 3 seconds, but it would later become significant to investigators who believed the response time was unusually delayed. Okay, honey, we'll send someone to check on her. What's Sarah's full name? And can you describe what she might be wearing? As Emma provided the information, she had no way of knowing that her 911 call had just been routed to Deputy Marcus Webb, Sheriff Tom Brennan's most trusted officer and the father of Tommy Brennan, Sarah's recent ex-boyfriend. At 10:03 p.m., Deputy Webb radioed that he was en route to Murphy's gas station. The drive from the sheriff's office should have taken 6 minutes. According to his official report, Deputy Webb arrived at 10:15 p.m., 12 minutes for a 6-minute drive. When I arrived at the scene, Webb wrote in his report, I found the payphone receiver hanging loose in the subject's vehicle, a 1989 Honda Civic, parked behind the station with the engine running and driver's door open. What Deputy Webb's report doesn't mention are several crucial details that would only surface years later through independent witness testimony. Bill Murphy, the gas station owner, was closing up when Deputy Webb arrived. In a 2018 interview with a private investigator hired by the Chen family, Murphy revealed information he claims he tried to share with police in 1996, but was told was irrelevant to the investigation. Webb didn't seem surprised to find the car empty, Murphy told the private investigator. He spent maybe 2 minutes looking around, then got on his radio. I heard him say something like situation contained or all clear. But it wasn't all clear. A girl was missing. When I tried to tell him I'd seen a dark sedan lurking around earlier that evening, he cut me off and said they'd handle it from there. More disturbing still, Murphy claimed that Deputy Webb spent considerable time at the payphone itself, examining it closely, and even making a call from it. He wiped down the receiver and the coin slot, Murphy recalled. Said he was checking for fingerprints, but he didn't have any equipment with him. No gloves, no evidence bags, nothing. By 10:30 p.m., other officers began arriving at the scene. Deputy Linda Reeves, now retired but willing to speak with us on condition of anonymity, was among the first responders. What she witnessed that night planted seeds of doubt that would grow over the decades. The scene felt wrong from the moment I got there, Deputy Reeves tells us via phone from her home in Florida. Webb was in charge, directing everyone around, but his instructions didn't follow standard procedure. He told us to focus on the wooded area behind the station. Said Sarah had probably gotten spooked and run into the trees. But there were no footprints leading that way. No broken branches, nothing to suggest she'd gone in that direction. More concerning to Deputy Reeves was what they weren't doing. We should have been canvassing for witnesses immediately, checking with other businesses, looking for that sedan Emma had mentioned. Instead, Webb had us tramping around in the dark woods for hours, destroying any potential evidence in the process. At 11:15 p.m., Sarah's parents arrived at Murphy's gas station. David and Chen had been contacted by Emma's mother, who thought they should know about the 911 call. What they found was a crime scene that seemed more like a confused search party than a professional investigation. I'll never forget the look on Deputy Webb's face when he saw us, David Chen told us in a rare interview at his home. It wasn't sympathy or concern. He looked annoyed, like we were interfering with something he was trying to manage. Lin Chen, Sarah's mother, was more direct in her assessment. He kept insisting that Sarah had probably just gotten scared and would turn up at home by morning. He kept saying teenage girls were dramatic and unpredictable. But I knew my daughter. Sarah wouldn't have just disappeared without a word. The Chen family's questions about the investigation began almost immediately. Why hadn't roadblocks been set up to look for the dark sedan? Why wasn't Sarah's description being broadcast to neighboring counties? Why did Deputy Webb seem more interested in controlling the narrative than finding their daughter? Their concerns were dismissed by Sheriff Brennan, who assured them that his department was doing everything possible. But behind the scenes, according to documents later obtained through legal proceedings, a very different conversation was taking place. Phone records show that between 10:45 p.m. and midnight on September 15, 1996, Deputy Webb made 17 calls from his personal cell phone. Most were to numbers registered to other members of the sheriff's department, but 3 were to a number registered to a business called Mountain View Consulting, a company that, according to state records, had no employees, no office, and had never filed a tax return. The investigation that should have been focused on finding Sarah Chen was instead becoming something else entirely. A carefully orchestrated effort to control information and manage public perception. But why would law enforcement officers want to cover up the disappearance of a teenage girl they claimed to be searching for? The answer, as we're beginning to understand, lies in what Sarah had discovered in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. According to her diary, found hidden in her bedroom days later, Sarah had stumbled upon something that connected several prominent Millbrook citizens to activities they would kill to keep secret. Her final diary entry, written just 2 days before she vanished, reads, "I know what they're really doing at those late-night meetings at the old Peterson farm. I know where the money is really coming from. And I know why certain people always seem to avoid getting in trouble no matter what they do. The question is, what do I do with this information?" As dawn broke on September 16, 1996, Sarah Chen had been missing for nearly 8 hours. The official search was about to expand, bringing in volunteers from across the county. But for those who knew what to look for, the signs of a cover-up were already becoming clear. The dark sedan with the broken headlight had vanished without a trace. The payphone's receiver had been wiped clean of fingerprints, and the security camera that should have captured everything had mysteriously malfunctioned at exactly the right time. Someone with power and resources was working very hard to make sure that whatever Sarah Chen had discovered would disappear along with her. But as we'll discover in our next episode, Sarah had taken precautions. She had hidden evidence in places that even a corrupt sheriff's department couldn't reach. And she had shared more information than anyone realized with someone who would spend the next 28 years trying to piece together the truth. 3 days after Sarah's disappearance, her parents made a heartbreaking decision that would ultimately crack open the conspiracy their daughter had died trying to expose. Desperate for any clue about where Sarah might have gone, David and Lynn Chen began searching every inch of their daughter's bedroom, a space they had always respected as private territory. "We felt terrible invading her privacy like that," Lynn Chen admits, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue during our interview. "But she was our baby, and we would have done anything to bring her home." Hidden behind Sarah's dresser, taped to the back panel where no casual observer would ever find it, was a composition notebook with a simple label on the cover: Private Thoughts, SCSC. What the Chen family discovered in those pages would transform their understanding of their daughter's final weeks and provide the first concrete evidence of why someone might want Sarah Chen to disappear. The diary spans 4 months, from May through September 1996. The early entries read like typical teenage musings: complaints about homework, excitement about summer plans, and confusion about her relationship with Tommy Brennan, the sheriff's son. But as the weeks progressed, Sarah's entries began documenting something far more sinister. The shift begins with an entry dated June 12, 1996. "Tommy's been acting weird lately. He keeps getting these phone calls late at night that make him really nervous. When I ask about them, he gets defensive and says it's family business. I'm starting to wonder if there's something about his family I don't know." This family business would become a recurring theme in Sarah's observations. Tommy Brennan, by all accounts a typical teenage boy more interested in baseball and cars than criminal activity, appeared to be increasingly burdened by knowledge he wasn't supposed to have. Sarah's entry from June 28th provides more detail. "Tommy let something slip tonight. We were talking about college plans when his phone rang. It was his dad, Sheriff Brennan. I could only hear Tommy's side, but he kept saying things like, 'I thought we agreed I wouldn't have to.' And but what if someone finds out?" When he hung up, he was shaking. I asked what was wrong and he said, "My dad wants me to help with something at the Peterson farm tomorrow night. But it's not police business, Sarah. And that scares me." The Peterson farm, mentioned in Sarah's final diary entry, was an abandoned property on the outskirts of Millbrook. According to county records, it had been foreclosed on in 1994 and sat empty ever since. But Sarah's diary suggests it was far from abandoned. Her entry from July 4th weekend reveals how she first discovered the farm's true purpose. "I followed Tommy tonight. I know I shouldn't have, but something felt wrong about the way he's been acting. He drove out to the old Peterson place around 11 p.m. I parked down the road and walked through the woods to get closer." What Sarah witnessed that night would haunt her for the remaining weeks of her life. "There were at least 8 cars parked behind the old barn," she wrote. "Expensive cars that don't belong to farmers. I recognized Sheriff Brennan's personal truck, but also Mayor Davidson's Cadillac and Judge Morrison's Mercedes. There were others I didn't recognize, license plates from out of state. Sarah described hiding in the tree line for over an hour, watching men in expensive suits carry briefcases in and out of the barn. Most disturbing of all, she recognized several of them as pillars of the Millbrook community, men who made speeches about law and order at town hall meetings and shook hands at church every Sunday. Tommy was there too, but he stayed by the cars the whole time, like a lookout, Sarah wrote. Every few minutes, someone would come out and hand him an envelope. He looked miserable, like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Sarah's investigations became more systematic as July turned to August. She began documenting license plate numbers, noting the timing and frequency of these gatherings, and trying to understand the connection between these midnight meetings and certain recent events in Millbrook. Her August 15th entry makes a chilling connection. I've been thinking about the Henderson drug bust last month. The one where they found 50 pounds of cocaine, but only arrested the 2 kids who were basically just lookouts. The real dealers, the ones with the money and the connections, they all seemed to disappear right before the raid, like someone warned them. Sarah was beginning to understand that the midnight meetings at Peterson Farm weren't just about local corruption. They were coordinating something much larger. Her diary entries reveal a teenager slowly piecing together evidence of a drug trafficking operation that reached far beyond Millbrook's borders. The breakthrough came in late August, when Sarah discovered something that would seal her fate. I can't believe what I found today, reads her August 29th entry. I was helping Dad organize his computer repair receipts when I noticed something strange. Judge Morrison has been paying for a lot of expensive computer equipment over the past year, way more than any normal home office would need. But the weird part is, Dad never actually delivered any of this equipment to the judge's house. All the deliveries went to the Peterson farm. David Chen, Sarah's father, confirms this detail when we speak with him. Sarah asked me about those invoices, and I didn't think much of it at the time, he recalls. Judge Morrison said he was setting up a home office for his retirement and wanted the equipment delivered to his farm property for storage. It seemed reasonable enough. But Sarah's investigation revealed that Judge Morrison didn't own any farm property. The equipment was being used to coordinate drug shipments, track money laundering operations, and maintain communication with criminal organizations across the tri-state area. Her September 1st entry shows how close she was getting to the truth. I think I understand now. This isn't just about selling drugs in Millbrook. This is a hub, a way station for moving product from the big cities to smaller towns all across Pennsylvania and Ohio. The Peterson farm is like a distribution center, and they're using Judge Morrison's computers to coordinate everything. But Sarah's most dangerous discovery was yet to come. On September 10th, just 5 days before her disappearance, Sarah wrote what may have been her death sentence. I know why certain arrests never stick. I know why evidence disappears from the sheriff's department. I know why some people can break the law in this town and never face consequences. It's not just Sheriff Brennan. It's Deputy Webb, Detective Morrison, even the county prosecutor. They're all part of it. Sarah had uncovered a corruption network that extended throughout Millbrook's law enforcement and judicial system. But her final entries suggest she had evidence, physical proof that could bring down the entire operation. I've been taking pictures, she wrote on September 12th. I have license plates, faces, documents that Tommy accidentally left in my car. I've hidden copies in 3 different places where they'll never think to look. If something happens to me, at least there will be a record. Her final entry, written on September 13th, just 2 days before she vanished, contains a chilling premonition. They know I know. Tommy's been asking strange questions about what I do after school, where I go, who I talk to. His father has been driving past our house at odd hours. I think they're trying to figure out how much I've learned and what I plan to do with the information. She concludes with words that would haunt everyone who read them. I've decided to tell Emma everything tomorrow. If they're planning to silence me, at least someone else will know the truth. The evidence is hidden where the voices carry farthest. Emma will understand what that means. But Sarah never got the chance to share her secrets with Emma in person. The next time they spoke was during that terrifying phone call from Murphy's gas station, when it was already too late. The diary painted a clear picture. Sarah Chen hadn't been the victim of a random crime or a teenage misadventure. She had been systematically investigating a criminal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of local government, and that investigation had marked her for elimination. But Sarah had been cleverer than her killers realized. Somewhere in Millbrook, evidence of their crimes remained hidden, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. When the Chen family brought Sarah's diary to the Millbrook Sheriff's Department on September 18, 1996, they expected it to transform the investigation. Instead, they encountered something that would shatter their faith in the system forever. Deputy Marcus Webb, the same officer who had responded to Sarah's disappearance with suspicious delays and questionable procedures, was assigned to review the diary's contents. According to the Chen family's account, Webb spent less than 10 minutes reading through months of detailed observations before dismissing them as teenage fantasies and conspiracy theories. He barely looked at it, David Chen recalls, his voice still carrying traces of the anger he felt that day. Sarah had documented dates, times, license plates, specific conversations. She had evidence of criminal activity, and he treated it like it was some kind of creative writing assignment. More disturbing still, Webb's official report makes no mention of the diary's specific allegations. Instead, it characterizes Sarah's writings as evidence of mental distress and paranoid delusions, suggesting that she had run away from home due to psychological issues rather than fear for her safety. But Emma Rodriguez understood what the authorities refused to acknowledge. When the Chen family shared selected diary entries with her, one phrase immediately caught her attention. "The evidence is hidden, where the voices carry farthest." I knew exactly what she meant, Emma tells us, her voice carrying both pride and sadness as she remembers her friend's cleverness. Sarah and I had this special place where we used to go to talk about private things. It was where you could speak in a normal voice and hear the echo come back from the mountains. She called it our voice amplifier. If Sarah wanted to hide something where I would find it, that's where she would put it. The location, Emma describes as a natural rock formation about 2 miles northeast of Millbrook, known locally as Echo Point. It's a limestone outcropping that creates a natural amphitheater effect, where sounds carry and bounce off the rock walls with unusual clarity. For Sarah and Emma, it had been their secret meeting place since middle school. Somewhere they could share their deepest thoughts without fear of being overheard. On September 20th, 1996, Emma hiked to Echo Point alone. What she found there would provide the first concrete evidence of Sarah's fate and the conspiracy that led to her death. There was a metal ammunition box wedged into a crack in the rocks, Emma remembers, the kind you can buy at any army surplus store. Sarah had wrapped it in plastic bags to keep it waterproof. Inside were things that proved everything she'd written in her diary was true. The contents of that box represented months of careful documentation by a teenager who understood she was risking her life to expose the truth. There were photographs taken with a disposable camera, showing license plates and faces of men entering and leaving the Peterson farm. There were photocopies of documents that Tommy Brennan had accidentally left in Sarah's car, shipping manifests, payment records, and communication logs that detailed drug trafficking operations across 3 states. Most damning of all were the audio recordings. Sarah had somehow managed to record portions of conversations during the midnight meetings at Peterson Farm. Using a small cassette recorder hidden in her jacket, she had captured Sheriff Brennan discussing payment schedules, Judge Morrison coordinating delivery routes, and Deputy Webb planning the intimidation of potential witnesses. The quality wasn't great, Emma explains, but you could clearly hear their voices. Sheriff Brennan was talking about cleaning up loose ends and making sure certain people understood the consequences of talking to outsiders. When I heard that, I realized Sarah wasn't just investigating drug trafficking. She was documenting plans for her own. Emma faced an impossible decision. The evidence in Sarah's hidden cache proved that the Millbrook Sheriff's Department was not just corrupt, but actively involved in her best friend's disappearance. Going to local authorities would be tantamount to signing her own death warrant. I was 17 years old, Emma says. I was terrified, and I didn't know who to trust. Sarah was gone, and the people who were supposed to protect us were the ones who had hurt her. Emma's solution was both clever and dangerous. Rather than approaching local law enforcement, she contacted the Pennsylvania State Police directly. But even this decision carried risks. There was no way to know how far the corruption extended or who might be feeding information back to Sheriff Brennan's operation. On September 25, 1996, Emma met with State Police Detective Raymond Morrison, who, despite sharing a surname with Judge Morrison, had no family connection to the Millbrook official. Detective Morrison's initial skepticism about Emma's claims quickly evaporated when she presented Sarah's evidence. "I've been investigating drug trafficking in this region for 8 years," Detective Morrison told us in a recent phone interview from his retirement home in Arizona, "but I'd never seen anything as comprehensive as what that teenage girl had put together. She had documented a criminal enterprise that we'd been trying to crack for months." The evidence Sarah had gathered revealed that the Peterson farm operation was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just a local drug dealing operation. It was a regional hub that coordinated the distribution of narcotics from major urban centers to smaller communities throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Sheriff Brennan and his associates had been using their positions in law enforcement to protect the operation, warning dealers about upcoming raids, making evidence disappear from police lockups, and ensuring that only low-level operators faced prosecution while the organizers remained untouchable. But Detective Morrison's investigation revealed something even more chilling. Sarah Chen wasn't their first victim. As we dug deeper into their operation, we found patterns. Detective Morrison explains. Over the past 3 years, there had been 4 other people who had gotten too close to their activities. 2 had died in what were ruled as accidents. 1 had supposedly committed suicide. Another had simply disappeared. Much like Sarah, the suicide case was particularly suspicious. A local accountant named Robert Hayes, who had been asking questions about unusual cash deposits at Millbrook's only bank. Hayes had allegedly hanged himself in his garage, but the state police review found inconsistencies in the crime scene that suggested murder disguised as suicide. These people were eliminating. As the state police investigation gained momentum, in early October 1996, something unexpected happened. Tommy Brennan approached Detective Morrison directly. The sheriff's son had been carrying an enormous burden of guilt and fear since Sarah's disappearance. According to Detective Morrison's case notes, Tommy revealed that his father had been forcing him to participate in the criminal operation since the previous summer, using threats against his mother and younger sister to ensure his compliance. Tommy told us that Sarah's murder wasn't planned, Detective Morrison recalls. She had approached his father directly, trying to negotiate some kind of deal where she would remain silent in exchange for being left alone. But during that meeting, she revealed just how much she knew and how much evidence she had gathered. That's when Sheriff Brennan realized she was too dangerous to leave alive. Tommy's testimony revealed the horrifying details of Sarah's final hours. After making her phone call to Emma, Sarah had been forced at gunpoint to drive to the Peterson farm, where Sheriff Brennan, Judge Morrison, and Deputy Webb were waiting. They had interrogated her about the evidence she had hidden, using increasingly violent methods to force her to reveal its location. When Sarah refused to tell them where she had hidden the evidence, they made a fatal decision. According to Tommy, his father said they couldn't risk her talking, Detective Morrison explains. They killed her at the Peterson farm and then spent the rest of the night disposing of her body and creating a cover story. But Sarah's killers had made a critical error. They had assumed that a teenage girl wouldn't have been clever enough to hide evidence where they couldn't find it, or smart enough to ensure that someone else would know where to look. Emma's discovery of the cache at Echo Point had provided law enforcement with everything they needed to bring down the entire operation. But it had also painted a target on her back, one that would force her to make an agonizing choice about her own safety. At 4:47 a.m. on October 15, 1996, a convoy of Pennsylvania State Police vehicles rolled through the pre-dawn darkness toward the Peterson farm. What they found there would validate every allegation in Sarah Chen's diary and confirm the worst fears of everyone who had suspected that her disappearance was more than a simple missing person case. Detective Raymond Morrison led the raid with a team of 12 officers, armed with search warrants that had taken weeks to secure through channels completely separate from local law enforcement. The operation's secrecy was paramount. Any leak to Sheriff Brennan's network could result in evidence destruction and the potential murder of additional witnesses. We knew we would only get one chance, Detective Morrison recalls. These people had been operating with impunity for years, protected by badges and judicial positions. If they realized we were coming, they would disappear everything that mattered, and probably eliminate anyone who could testify against them. The first shock came when officers discovered that the supposedly abandoned Peterson farm was anything but deserted. The main farmhouse had been converted into a sophisticated command center, complete with multiple phone lines, computer equipment, and detailed maps marking drug distribution routes across 3 states. In the barn where Sarah had observed those midnight meetings, investigators found evidence of an operation that dwarfed their initial estimates. Shipping containers held thousands of pounds of processed narcotics, while filing cabinets contained meticulous records of transactions dating back 4 years. But the most damning discovery was in the farmhouse basement. We found what could only be described as an interrogation room, Detective Morrison explains, his voice still carrying traces of the revulsion he felt that morning. There were restraints, recording equipment, and stains on the concrete floor that tested positive for human blood. Multiple human blood samples from different individuals. Among the evidence recovered from this basement room were Sarah Chen's silver locket, the same one found broken at the payphone, and a cassette tape labeled with her name and the date September 15, 1996. The contents of that tape would haunt investigators for years to come. Sarah's voice, terrified but defiant, could be heard answering questions about her investigation. Sheriff Brennan, Judge Morrison, and Deputy Webb took turns interrogating her, demanding to know where she had hidden the evidence and who else she had told about their operation. You can hear her refusing to give them what they wanted, Detective Morrison says. Even facing death, that brave girl wouldn't betray her friend or reveal where she had hidden the proof of their crimes. Her last words on the tape were, "Emma will find what she needs to find, and you'll never be safe again." The tape ended abruptly, followed by sounds that the investigators couldn't include in their official reports, but which left no doubt about Sarah's fate. While the raid team processed evidence at the Peterson farm, a coordinated operation was unfolding across Millbrook. State police officers simultaneously executed search warrants at Sheriff Brennan's home, Judge Morrison's residence, Deputy Webb's apartment, and the office's Mountain View Consulting, the mysterious business that had been receiving payments from the drug operation. At Judge Morrison's house, investigators discovered computer equipment that matched David Chen's repair invoices, along with encrypted files containing the names and contact information for drug dealers across the region. The judge's personal financial records revealed deposits totaling over $2 million in offshore accounts over the previous 3 years. Sheriff Brennan's home yielded equally damning evidence. Hidden in a safe behind a false wall were photographs documenting the murders of the operation's previous victims, apparently kept as insurance against his criminal partners. The photos confirmed that Robert Hayes, the accountant who had supposedly committed suicide, had actually been tortured before his death. But perhaps the most shocking discovery came at Deputy Webb's apartment, where investigators found detailed surveillance files on dozens of Millbrook residents. Webb had been systematically monitoring anyone who showed curiosity about unusual activities in town, compiling lists of potential threats to the operation. Emma Rodriguez's name appeared on that list, along with a notation that read, "Priority target. Knows too much. Permanent solution required." When I saw Emma's file, I knew we had gotten to them just in time, Detective Morrison recalls. There were surveillance photos of her house, her school schedule, even notes about her daily routines. They were planning to kill her within days of our raid. The arrests began at dawn. Sheriff Tom Brennan was taken into custody at his home, still in his pajamas as his wife and children watched in horror. Judge Morrison attempted to flee, but was apprehended at the county airport with a suitcase full of cash and a ticket to a non-extradition country. Deputy Webb barricaded himself in his apartment for 6 hours, before surrendering to the SWAT team. But the criminal network's response was swift and vicious. By noon on October 15th, word of the arrest had spread throughout Millbrook. Rather than relief that a criminal conspiracy had been exposed, many residents expressed anger and disbelief. Sheriff Brennan had been a respected figure in the community for over 20 years, and Judge Morrison came from one of the town's founding families. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Emma Rodriguez remembers. People were saying that Sarah must have been involved in drugs herself, that she had gotten in over her head with criminals from outside town. They couldn't accept that their trusted leaders were murderers. Emma's family began receiving threatening phone calls within hours of the arrests. Cars drove slowly past their house at all hours of the night. Graffiti appeared on their garage door calling Emma a liar and a snitch. The message was clear: speaking out against the criminal network, even after its leaders were in custody, carried deadly consequences. My parents were terrified, Emma explains. We realized that even though the main players were arrested, there had to be other people involved who were still free. People who wanted to make sure I never testified at trial. The threats escalated when Emma's mother was followed home from work by two men in a dark sedan. A detail that sent chills through everyone who remembered Sarah's final phone call. When Emma's younger brother was approached by strangers asking questions about his sister's whereabouts, the family knew they were running out of time. Detective Morrison made the recommendation that would save Emma's life, but forever change her future: witness protection. Without her identification of the voices on those audio recordings, we couldn't guarantee convictions. But keeping her safe meant taking her away from everything she had ever known. On October 22nd, 1996, exactly 1 week after the raid, 17-year-old Emma Rodriguez said goodbye to her family, her friends, and her hometown forever. Under the protection of federal marshals, she was relocated to a city over 1,000 miles away, given a new identity, and enrolled in a new school where no one knew about her connection to the biggest criminal case in Pennsylvania's recent history. I never got to attend Sarah's funeral, Emma tells us, tears streaming down her face even after all these years. I never got to say goodbye to my friends or finish my senior year. I had to leave everything behind because I chose to honor my best friend's memory by telling the truth. But Emma's sacrifice ensured that justice could proceed. The evidence from the Peterson farm combined with Tommy Brennan's testimony and Emma's identification of the recorded voices built an unshakable case against the criminal network. However, as the legal proceedings began, it became clear that the corruption in Millbrook ran even deeper than anyone had imagined. Defense attorneys with seemingly unlimited resources appeared to represent the accused. Witnesses began changing their stories or refusing to cooperate. Evidence started disappearing from police storage facilities. The fight for justice was just beginning, and the forces trying to protect the criminal network would prove they still had significant power, even from behind bars. The first sign that the criminal network still had powerful allies came just 48 hours after the arrests. District Attorney Patricia Mills, who should have been preparing for the most significant prosecution in the county's history, instead held a press conference that sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Standing before a room full of reporters on October 17, 1996, Mills announced that she was concerned about the rushed nature of the arrests and questioned whether the state police had sufficient evidence to justify such dramatic action against respected community leaders. Detective Raymond Morrison watched that press conference from his office in disbelief. We had given Mills's office copies of everything, he recalls. The audio recordings, the financial records, Tommy Brennan's confession, the physical evidence from the Peterson farm. She had enough evidence to convict all three men 10 times over. Yet she was standing there acting like we had arrested them based on rumors and speculation. What Detective Morrison didn't know at the time was that District Attorney Mills had been receiving regular payments from the same offshore accounts that had been funding Judge Morrison's lifestyle. This information would only surface years later during a federal investigation. But the pattern of obstruction began immediately. Mills's office started by challenging the validity of the search warrants, claiming they had been obtained through improper channels and without adequate oversight from local authorities. The irony was lost on no one. She was arguing that the state police should have consulted with the very people they were investigating. More troubling still, key pieces of evidence began disappearing from the district attorney's office. The original audio recordings that Sarah had made at the Peterson farm vanished from a supposedly secure evidence locker. Financial documents proving money laundering activities were misfiled and couldn't be located. Even some of the surveillance photographs from Deputy Webb's apartment mysteriously went missing. It was like watching evidence evaporate in real time, Detective Morrison explains. Every week, something else would be lost, damaged, or declared inadmissible. These weren't accidents. This was a systematic effort to sabotage the prosecution. The defense attorneys representing the three accused men were equally suspicious. Rather than the overworked public defenders typically assigned to such cases, Sheriff Brennan, Judge Morrison, and Deputy Webb were represented by a team of high-powered criminal lawyers from Philadelphia and New York. Attorneys whose fees would have cost more than the defendants' combined annual salaries. Lead defense attorney Marcus Rothstein had built his reputation defending organized crime figures and corrupt politicians. His strategy became clear during the preliminary hearings. Rather than denying his clients' involvement in criminal activity, he would argue that they had been acting as undercover agents in a long-term federal investigation. Rothstein claimed that Sheriff Brennan and his associates were heroes, recalls former prosecutor Janet Holloway, who worked in the district attorney's office at the time, and agreed to speak with us anonymously. According to his version, they had infiltrated a major drug trafficking network and were gathering evidence to bring down the real criminals. Sarah Chen's murder, he argued, was committed by outside dealers who discovered the undercover operation. This defense strategy, while obviously fabricated, proved surprisingly effective in a community still struggling to accept that their trusted leaders were criminals. It provided a narrative that allowed people to maintain their faith in the system while explaining away the disturbing evidence. But the defense team's most devastating weapon wasn't legal arguments. It was intimidation. On November 12, 1996, Maria Santos, the owner of Millie's Diner where Sarah had worked, was found dead in her home. The official cause of death was ruled a heart attack, but Santos had no history of cardiac problems and had been scheduled to testify about the threatening phone call Sarah received on her final day of work. 2 weeks later, Bill Murphy, the gas station owner who had witnessed Deputy Webb's suspicious behavior on the night of Sarah's disappearance, was hospitalized after a hit-and-run accident that left him with severe brain trauma. Murphy survived but suffered memory loss that made his testimony unreliable. These weren't coincidences. Detective Morrison insists. We were watching potential witnesses die or become incapacitated at a rate that defied statistical probability. Someone was systematically eliminating people who could testify against the defendants. The most chilling incident occurred in December 1996, when Detective Morrison himself became a target. Returning home from work one evening, he discovered that his house had been broken into. Nothing of value was stolen, but a clear message had been left. Photographs of his wife and 2 young daughters were scattered across his kitchen table, with their faces circled in red marker. That night, I realized we weren't just fighting 3 corrupt local officials, Detective Morrison recalls. We were up against an organization with resources and reach that extended far beyond Millbrook. They could get to anyone, anywhere, anytime they chose. Despite these setbacks, the prosecution pressed forward, bolstered by one crucial advantage. Emma Rodriguez's testimony remained secure. Hidden in witness protection, she was beyond the reach of the intimidation campaign that was destroying other witnesses. But even Emma's safety was threatened when the defense team filed a motion demanding her current location. The motion was ultimately denied, but it demonstrated that the criminal network was actively trying to locate and silence the one witness who could definitively tie them to Sarah's murder. The trial began on March 15, 1997, in a courthouse surrounded by unprecedented security. Federal marshals supplemented local law enforcement, and metal detectors were installed at every entrance. The media attention was intense, with reporters from major newspapers and television networks covering what had become known as the Millbrook conspiracy. Tommy Brennan's testimony on the third day of the trial provided the most dramatic moments. Now 19 years old and visibly tormented by guilt, he described in detail how his father had forced him to participate in the criminal operation and witness Sarah's interrogation and murder. "My dad told me that if I ever said anything, they would kill my mother and my little sister," Tommy testified, breaking down on the witness stand. He said Sarah's death was my fault because I had gotten too close to her, and that if I wanted to protect my family, I had to help them cover it up. Tommy's testimony was devastating, but the defense team was prepared. They presented evidence that Tommy had been receiving psychological treatment for depression and had made previous statements that proved inconsistent with his trial testimony. They painted him as an unreliable witness whose memories had been distorted by guilt and mental illness. More damaging to the prosecution's case was the revelation that several key pieces of evidence had been compromised while in the custody of the district attorney's office. The original interrogation tape of Sarah had been accidentally recorded over with a local radio station broadcast. The photographs from Deputy Webb's surveillance files had been damaged by water during a supposed leak in the evidence room. As the trial progressed through the spring of 1997, it became clear that the systematic destruction of evidence was having its intended effect. Without the audio recordings and photographic proof, the case relied heavily on witness testimony. Testimony that was being systematically undermined through intimidation, memory loss, or convenient deaths. The prosecution's difficulties reached a crisis point in April, when their star witness, Detective Morrison himself, was removed from the case. An internal affairs investigation, launched by complaints about his unprofessional conduct, found that he had violated department protocols in his handling of evidence and witness interviews. "They destroyed my career to protect their conspiracy," Detective Morrison says bitterly. 23 years of exemplary service meant nothing when I got too close to the truth. They removed me from the case and transferred me to a desk job investigating parking meter violations. With Detective Morrison sidelined and key evidence missing or compromised, the prosecution faced an impossible challenge. They still had Emma's testimony about finding Sarah's evidence cache, but without the physical proof to corroborate her account, the defense could argue that she was lying or mistaken. As the trial moved toward closing arguments in late April 1997, both sides knew that the verdict would depend on whether the jury believed the word of a teenager in witness protection against three respected community leaders represented by the best legal talent money could buy. But the defense team had one final surprise that would threaten to destroy not just the prosecution's case, but Emma Rodriguez's life as well. On April 28, 1997, the Millbrook conspiracy trial entered its most dramatic phase. Defense attorney Marcus Rothstein stood before the jury for his closing arguments, preparing to deliver what he promised would be irrefutable proof that his clients were innocent victims of a misguided investigation. What happened next would haunt everyone in that courtroom for decades to come. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rothstein began, "the prosecution's entire case rests on the testimony of one person. A young woman who claims to have found evidence that conveniently supports every allegation against my clients. But what if I told you that this witness has been lying about who she really is?" Emma Rodriguez, testifying under her new identity as Jennifer Morrison, sat in the witness protection section of the courtroom as Rothstein approached the judge with a manila folder. "Your Honor, I have evidence that proves the prosecution's star witness has been using a false identity, not just in this courtroom, but for her entire testimony." The revelation sent shockwaves through the proceedings. Somehow, despite the elaborate security measures, Rothstein had discovered Emma's real name and her connection to Sarah Chen. Or still, he was about to reveal her new identity to a courtroom full of reporters and spectators. Federal Marshal David Torres, responsible for Emma's protection, immediately stood and approached the bench. "Your Honor, this information is classified for witness safety, revealing it could endanger the witness's life." But Rothstein was prepared for this objection. Your Honor, how can my clients receive a fair trial when the prosecution's key witness is operating under false pretenses? The jury has the right to know who is actually testifying against my clients and what motivation she might have to lie. Judge Patricia Hendricks, brought in from another county to avoid conflicts of interest, faced an impossible decision. Protecting Emma's identity was crucial for her safety, but the defense had legitimate concerns about witness credibility. In the end, Judge Hendricks reached a compromise that satisfied no one. She ordered the courtroom sealed and all media removed while the defense presented their evidence about Emma's identity. Only the jury, legal teams, and essential court personnel would remain. Even with the media gone, I knew my life was over, Emma recalls. There were still people in that courtroom who could report back to whoever was coordinating the cover-up. My location, my new name, my new life, all of it was about to be exposed. Rostein's evidence was both thorough and terrifying in its implications. He had photographs of Emma entering her new high school in Denver, records of her enrollment under her assumed name, and even details about her part-time job at a local bookstore. Someone had been tracking her movable bookstore, summoning information that could only have come from sources. She is Emma Rodriguez, the best friend of the alleged victim, who has every reason to fabricate evidence to ensure my client's conviction. The prosecution team was blindsided. They had no idea how the defense had obtained this information, but the implications were clear. If the criminal network could penetrate federal witness protection, then no one involved in the case was truly safe. Emma's testimony continued for 2 more grueling days as Rostein systematically attacked her credibility. He questioned her memory of events from months earlier, suggested that grief and anger had motivated her to fabricate evidence, and implied that she had planted the cache at Echo Point rather than discovered it there. He made me feel like I was the criminal, Emma remembers. He kept asking why a 17-year-old girl would go hiking alone to such a remote location. Why I hadn't brought adult supervision when retrieving the evidence. Why I hadn't immediately turned everything over to local authorities instead of the state police. But Emma's testimony, despite the relentless cross-examination, remained consistent and compelling. She provided specific details about Sarah's behavior in her final weeks, accurately described the contents of the evidence cache, and identified voices on the audio recordings that had since been lost from the evidence locker. Most importantly, Emma revealed something that she had kept secret even from the prosecution team until that moment. Sarah gave me something else, Emma testified on her final day on the stand. Something I didn't mention before, because I was afraid it would put more people in danger. The courtroom fell silent as Emma described a second hiding place that Sarah had mentioned during their final phone conversation. A location that contained backup copies of the most damaging evidence against the criminal network. She told me that if anything happened to her, I should check the place where we carved our initials in 7th grade. Emma explained. She said there would be enough evidence there to make the whole house of cards fall down. This revelation sent the prosecution team scrambling. The location Emma described was a large oak tree near Millbrook Elementary School, where she and Sarah had indeed carved their initials years earlier. If Sarah had hidden additional evidence there, it could provide the missing pieces needed to secure convictions. But investigators searched the tree the following day. They found only an empty metal box and clear signs that someone had recently removed its contents. Someone had beaten us there, prosecutor Janet Holloway explains. The box was still in place, but it had been emptied recently, probably within days of Emma's testimony. Someone was monitoring the trial proceedings and acting on information as it was revealed. The defense team's reaction to Emma's testimony about the second cache was telling. Rather than dismissing it as another fabrication, they immediately filed motions demanding to know why the prosecution had withheld this information and why they hadn't secured all potential evidence before the trial began. The response suggested they knew exactly what had been in that second hiding place, and they had made sure it would never see the inside of a courtroom. As the trial moved toward jury deliberations in early May 1997, both sides knew that the case had been compromised beyond repair. Key evidence was missing. Witnesses had been intimidated or eliminated, and the prosecution's star witness had been exposed to deadly retaliation. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching verdicts that stunned everyone involved in the case. Sheriff Tom Brennan, not guilty on all charges. Judge Morrison, guilty of conspiracy, but not guilty of murder. Sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Deputy Webb, guilty of obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Sentenced to 5 years in state prison. The verdicts represented a devastating blow to the prosecution and the Chen family's quest for justice. Despite overwhelming evidence of a criminal conspiracy, the systematic tampering and intimidation campaign had succeeded in creating reasonable doubt about the murder charges. I watched David and Lynn Chen's faces when those verdicts were read. Emma recalls, tears streaming down her cheeks even decades later. They had lost their daughter, and the system had failed them completely. The man who ordered Sarah's murder was walking free. The acquittal of Sheriff Brennan was particularly galling, given Tommy Brennan's testimony about his father's direct involvement in Sarah's interrogation and murder. But the defense had successfully argued that Tommy was an unreliable witness whose testimony had been coerced by investigators. Judge Morrison's conviction on conspiracy charges provided little comfort. 7 years in federal prison for his role in a multi-million-dollar drug trafficking operation seemed inadequate, and his acquittal on murder charges meant he would likely serve less than 5 years with good behavior. Deputy Webb's conviction was the most satisfying for the prosecution, but his 5-year sentence for conspiracy and obstruction seemed laughably light given his role in covering up multiple murders. Outside the courthouse, as Sheriff Brennan walked free, surrounded by supporters who still believed in his innocence, Emma Rodriguez realized that her sacrifice had been for nothing. She had given up her identity, her family, her entire life, and the people responsible for her best friend's murder were still walking free. But the verdicts in the Millbrook conspiracy trial would prove to be just the beginning of a much larger investigation. The federal government had been watching the proceedings with growing alarm, and the evidence of corruption in the judicial system would trigger a response that would ultimately bring down dozens of officials across multiple states. Emma's courage in testifying, despite the threats to her safety and the exposure of her identity, had planted seeds that would eventually grow into one of the largest public corruption investigations in American history. 3 weeks after the Millbrook verdicts, FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh received a call that would consume the next 5 years of her career. As head of the Bureau's Public Corruption Unit for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, Walsh had been quietly monitoring the trial proceedings with growing alarm. What we witnessed in Millbrook wasn't just a case of local corruption. Agent Walsh tells us from her office in Washington, D.C., where she now serves as Deputy Director of the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division. It was a systematic subversion of the justice system that suggested criminal networks were operating with protection at multiple levels of government. The federal investigation, codenamed Operation Broken Trust, began officially on May 23, 1997. Unlike the state-level prosecution that had been hampered by local connections and limited resources, the federal task force had access to advanced surveillance technology, unlimited jurisdiction, and investigators who had no ties to Pennsylvania's political establishment. Agent Walsh's team started with a simple but chilling question. How had defense attorney Marcus Rothstein obtained classified information about Emma Rodriguez's location and new identity? The answer would lead them to a conspiracy that extended far beyond the Peterson farm drug operation. We discovered that the breach of witness protection wasn't a lucky break for the defense, Agent Walsh explains. It was the result of a systematic infiltration of federal agencies by criminal organizations. They had sources inside the U.S. Marshal Service, the FBI, and even the Justice Department itself. The investigation revealed that several federal employees had been receiving payments from the same offshore accounts that had funded the Millbrook operation. These corrupt officials had been providing intelligence about ongoing investigations, warning criminal networks about planned raids, and compromising witness protection cases across multiple states. Emma Rodriguez had been just one of dozens of protected witnesses whose identities had been sold to the highest bidder. When we realized the scope of the breach, we had to assume that everything about our investigation was compromised, Agent Walsh recalls. We couldn't trust our own communication systems, our own personnel, or even our own evidence storage facilities. The federal task force relocated their operation to a secure facility outside Philadelphia, staffed entirely with investigators who had been extensively vetted for any connections to the compromised networks. They began rebuilding the Sarah Chen murder case from scratch, using resources that had been beyond the reach of the state investigation. Most importantly, it had something the state prosecution had lacked: the full cooperation of Tommy Brennan. After his father's acquittal, Tommy had contacted the FBI directly, driven by guilt over his testimony's apparent ineffectiveness and fear that his family was still in danger. What he revealed to federal investigators painted a picture of criminal activity that went back decades and reached into the highest levels of state government. Tommy told us that the Peterson Farm operation was just one hub in a network that spanned 7 states. Agent Walsh explains. They were moving drugs from Mexico through Texas, up through Tennessee and Kentucky, and into the Northeast Corridor. The Pennsylvania operation alone was generating over $50 million annually. But Tommy's most shocking revelation concerned the scope of official corruption protecting the network. He had overheard conversations between his father and other officials that mentioned governors, senators, even federal judges who were either receiving payments or being blackmailed into cooperation. Agent Walsh continues. What we thought was a local corruption case was actually part of a criminal enterprise that had infiltrated government at every level. The federal investigation expanded rapidly as agents followed financial trails that led to political campaigns, judicial appointments, and law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Bank records revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation that had been moving criminal proceeds through legitimate businesses for over a decade. Meanwhile, Emma Rodriguez was fighting for her life in a very different way. After her identity was exposed during the trial, Emma had been relocated to a new city under an assumed name for the 3rd time in less than 2 years. But the psychological toll was becoming unbearable. I was 19 years old and I had no identity left, Emma explains during our interview, her voice still carrying the pain of those years. I couldn't contact my family, couldn't maintain friendships, couldn't even use my real name. I was a ghost. And I was starting to wonder if Sarah had been lucky to die as herself, rather than live as no one. The federal marshals protecting Emma were themselves under investigation for the security breach, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that made her isolation even more complete. She was moved 6 times in 18 months as investigators tried to stay ahead of the criminal networks tracking her. But Emma's situation began to improve when Agent Walsh's team made a breakthrough that would finally provide the evidence needed to bring down the entire conspiracy. In October 1998, federal investigators executed simultaneous raids across 7 states, targeting not just drug operations, but the network of corrupt officials protecting them. The raids were coordinated with military precision, using encrypted communications and personnel who had been isolated from potentially compromised channels. At a storage facility in Baltimore, agents discovered something that validated every allegation Sarah Chen had made in her diary. A complete archive of the criminal network's operations, including detailed records of official corruption dating back to 1987. Someone in the organization had been keeping meticulous records of every payment, every favor, every compromise, Agent Walsh recalls. We found evidence of bribes to sitting judges, kickbacks to law enforcement officials, and blackmail material on elected officials, from city council members to U.S. congressmen. Most importantly for Sarah's case, the archive contained the original audio recordings that had disappeared from the district attorney's evidence room. Sarah's voice, clear and defiant despite her terror, provided undeniable proof of her interrogation and murder. But the archive also contained something else: recordings of Sheriff Brennan discussing the murder with his superiors in the criminal organization. We heard Brennan reporting to someone he called the Colonel about the Sarah Chen situation, Agent Walsh explains. He was describing the interrogation, the disposal of her body, and the plan to frame her disappearance as a runaway case. But most importantly, he was taking orders from someone higher up in the organization. The identity of the colonel would become the focus of the investigation's final phase. Analysis of the recordings, combined with financial records and surveillance footage, eventually led agents to a shocking conclusion. The head of the criminal network was a decorated former military officer who had used his government connections to build a drug trafficking empire that had corrupted law enforcement agencies across the eastern United States. Colonel James Whitmore, a Vietnam veteran who had transitioned from military service to a career in federal law enforcement, had been using his position as a consultant to various agencies to identify and corrupt key personnel. He had built a network of assets that included sheriffs, judges, prosecutors, and federal agents who could protect his operations from investigation. The revelation that a former federal law enforcement official was behind Sarah Chen's murder added a new dimension to the case and explained how the criminal network had been able to operate with such impunity. As 1999 began, Agent Walsh's team prepared for a series of arrests that would finally bring justice to Sarah Chen and dozens of other victims of the corruption network. But they also knew that taking down Colonel Whitmore and his organization would be dangerous. These people had already demonstrated their willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operation. Emma Rodriguez, still living under federal protection, was preparing to testify once again. But this time, the stakes were even higher, and the enemies she faced were more powerful and more ruthless than anything she had encountered before. The federal investigation had uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy that had cost Sarah Chen her life. Now it remained to be seen whether the justice system, even at the federal level, could deliver the accountability that had been denied in Millbrook. At 5:00 a.m. on March 15, 2000, nearly 4 years after Sarah Chen's murder, federal agents executed the largest coordinated law enforcement operation in Pennsylvania's history. Operation Broken Trust's final phase involved over 300 FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and DA officers conducting simultaneous arrests across 7 states. The primary target was Colonel James Whitmore's compound in the mountains of West Virginia, where the 58-year-old former military officer had been directing his criminal empire from a fortress-like estate surrounded by private security and surveillance systems that rivaled those of foreign intelligence agencies. Whitmore had turned his property into a miniature military base, Agent Walsh recalls. We had to use tactical teams more suited for overseas operations than domestic law enforcement. He had motion sensors, armed guards, and communication jamming equipment that made a standard arrest impossible. The siege of Whitmore's compound lasted 14 hours. When federal agents finally breached the main house, they discovered the colonel in his study, calmly destroying documents in a fireplace while classical music played in the background. His final act of defiance was attempting to delete encrypted files from a computer system that contained the names and compromising information on hundreds of corrupted officials. Fortunately for investigators, Whitmore's specialist, a man named Marcus Chen, who had no relation to Sarah's family, had been secretly cooperating with federal authorities for months. He had installed backup systems that preserved every file Whitmore thought he was destroying. When we recovered those encrypted files, we realized we had evidence of corruption that went back to the 1980s, Agent Walsh explains. Whitmore had been building this network for over a decade, systematically identifying and compromising officials who could protect his operations. The arrests that followed read like a who's who of Eastern Seaboard politics and law enforcement. 3 sitting judges, including 1 federal judge, were taken into custody. 2 county sheriffs, 5 state police commanders, and a dozen municipal police chiefs were arrested on various corruption charges. Most shocking of all was the arrest of Pennsylvania Attorney General Robert Mitchell, whose office had supposedly been overseeing the investigation into public corruption. Mitchell had been receiving monthly payments of $50,000 in exchange for providing advance warning of federal investigations and ensuring that certain cases never reached prosecution. But the arrest that provided the most personal satisfaction to those who had fought for justice in Sarah's case was that of District Attorney Patricia Mills. The woman who had sabotaged the original prosecution was led away in handcuffs, charged with obstruction of justice, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Seeing Mills arrested was a moment I had been dreaming about for 3 years, former Detective Raymond Morrison tells us. He had been secretly cooperating with the federal investigation since losing his job, providing crucial intelligence about the local corruption network. She had betrayed her oath, her community, and the memory of a murdered girl. Watching her perp walk was one of the most satisfying moments of my career. The federal arrests also swept up Sheriff Tom Brennan, despite his acquittal in the state trial. Federal prosecutors had evidence of his involvement in the broader racketeering conspiracy, including his role in ordering the murders of at least 6 people who had threatened the network's operations. Judge Morrison and Deputy Webb, already serving their minimal state sentences, found themselves facing additional federal charges that would extend their prison terms by decades. As the full scope of Whitmore's network became clear through the recovered files, investigators discovered that Sarah Chen had been even more prescient than anyone realized. Her amateur investigation had identified the key figures and operational methods of a criminal organization that federal agencies had been trying to infiltrate for years. Sarah was essentially conducting a one-person intelligence operation. Agent Walsh reflects. She had identified money laundering routes, corruption networks, and operational procedures that our trained agents had been unable to penetrate. If she had lived, she could have brought down this entire organization 3 years earlier and saved dozens of lives. The files also revealed the true extent of the network's brutality. Beyond Sarah's murder, investigators found evidence linking Whitmore's organization to 23 additional homicides across 7 states. The victims included journalists, prosecutors, witnesses, and even low-level criminals who had become liability risks. One particularly chilling discovery was a detailed file on Emma Rodriguez that contained not just her current location and assumed identity, but plans for her assassination that had been scheduled for the week after the federal raids. Emma had unknowingly been living on borrowed time, protected only by the timing of the arrests. When Agent Walsh showed me that file, I realized how close I had come to joining Sarah. Emma reflects. They had photographs of my apartment, my work schedule, even the route I took to the grocery store. If the federal investigation had taken another week, I would have been dead. With Whitmore and his network in custody, federal prosecutors finally had the evidence and security needed to bring Sarah Chen's killers to justice. The federal trial, which began in September 2000, was held under unprecedented security measures in a courthouse that had been essentially transformed into a fortress. Emma Rodriguez, now 23 years old, took the witness stand for what she hoped would be the final time. Her testimony, delivered with the poise and determination of someone who had survived years of threats and intimidation, provided the emotional anchor for a case built on thousands of pages of financial records and surveillance evidence. Sarah Chen was my best friend, and she died because she believed in justice. Emma told the jury during her direct examination. She believed that the truth mattered more than her own safety. These men killed her not because she was a threat to their profits, but because she represented everything they had dedicated their lives to destroying: honesty, courage, and faith in the system. But Emma's most powerful moment came during cross-examination, when Colonel Whitmore's attorney attempted to portray Sarah as a naive teenager who had gotten in over her head with dangerous criminals. Sarah wasn't naive, Emma responded, her voice carrying 4 years of pain and determination. She was brilliant and brave and careful. She spent months documenting your client's crimes because she knew that people like her, young people, ordinary people, were the only ones who could expose corruption when the system itself was compromised. She died because she was right, not because she was wrong. The federal trial lasted 4 months and resulted in convictions for all major defendants. Colonel Whitmore received life without parole for racketeering, murder, and conspiracy charges. Sheriff Brennan was sentenced to death for his role in multiple murders, though he would die of a heart attack in prison before the sentence could be carried out. District Attorney Mills received 25 years for corruption and obstruction of justice. Judge Morrison's federal sentence added 30 years to his existing term, ensuring he would die in prison. Deputy Webb, the lowest-ranking member of the conspiracy, received 15 additional years. Perhaps most importantly, the federal investigation led to systemic reforms in law enforcement, oversight and witness protection protocols that continue to this day. The corruption network that had operated with impunity for over a decade was not just destroyed, it was replaced with systems designed to prevent similar conspiracies from taking root. As the verdicts were read in January 2001, David and Lynn Chen sat in the front row of the courthouse, holding hands and finally hearing the words they had been waiting nearly 5 years to hear. Guilty on all counts for the murder of their daughter. We knew Sarah was gone forever, Lynn Chen told reporters outside the courthouse. But knowing that her killers would finally face justice, that her sacrifice had helped bring down this entire network of corruption, it gave her death meaning beyond the tragedy. Emma Rodriguez, her ordeal finally over, faced a different kind of challenge, rebuilding a life that had been on hold for over 4 years. At 23, she had to learn how to exist without the constant fear that had defined her young adulthood. But Sarah's story was not quite finished. The federal investigation had answered most questions about her murder and the conspiracy that caused it, but one mystery remained. Where was Sarah Chen buried? In the spring of 2001, as the dust settled from the federal convictions, FBI agent Catherine Walsh received an unexpected visitor at her Philadelphia office. Marcus Chen, not the IT specialist who had helped bring down Whitmore, but a completely different man who shared only a surname with Sarah's family, had spent months wrestling with information that could finally provide closure to the Chen family's ordeal. Marcus Chen was a construction foreman who had worked on various projects for Colonel Whitmore's organization throughout the 1990s. Like many legitimate contractors, he had unknowingly provided services to the criminal network, building storage facilities and safe houses across Pennsylvania and West Virginia. I didn't know what kind of people they really were, Marcus explains during our interview at his home in Pittsburgh. They paid well, they paid on time, and they didn't ask questions about my work. It wasn't until I saw the news coverage of the trials that I realized who I had been working for. What brought Marcus to Agent Walsh's office was a specific memory from September 1996. A late-night construction job he had been asked to complete at the Peterson farm just days after Sarah's disappearance. Whitmore's people called me on September 18th, Marcus recalls. They said they needed a concrete slab poured, no questions asked. They offered me triple my normal rate for emergency work, which should have been a red flag, but the money was too good to pass up. Marcus described arriving at the Peterson farm around midnight to find a hole already dug behind the main barn. His job was simple: pour concrete into the excavated area and smooth it to match the existing farmyard. The work took 4 hours, and he was paid in cash before dawn. I remember thinking it was weird that they wanted concrete poured in the middle of the night, Marcus continued. I figured they were trying to finish some kind of foundation work without disrupting their other activities. It wasn't until Marcus saw television coverage of the federal investigation that he realized the horrifying truth. He had likely been pouring concrete over Sarah Chen's grave. Agent Walsh immediately organized a search team to excavate the area Marcus had described. On June 12, 2001, nearly 5 years after Sarah's disappearance, investigators began the delicate process of removing the concrete slab that had been poured over her final resting place. David and Lynn Chen stood at the edge of the Peterson farm property, holding each other as excavation equipment carefully broke through the concrete Marcus had poured that September night in 1996. Emma Rodriguez, now living under her real name for the first time in years, stood beside them as the friend who had never stopped fighting for Sarah's memory. When they found her, it was both the most heartbreaking and the most relieving moment of my life, Lynn Chen tells us, dabbing at tears that still come easily when she discusses that day. We could finally bring our baby home. The remains confirmed what everyone already knew. Sarah Chen had been murdered at the Peterson farm, just as Tommy Brennan had testified. But the discovery provided something more valuable than evidence. It gave the Chen family the chance to lay their daughter to rest with dignity. Sarah's funeral, held on July 4, 2021, drew hundreds of mourners from across Pennsylvania. The service was attended not just by family and friends, but by many of the law enforcement officers who had fought to bring her killers to justice. Agent Walsh, Detective Morrison, and even some of the federal prosecutors who had secured the convictions came to pay their respects. Emma Rodriguez delivered the eulogy, speaking about the friend whose courage had changed her life and whose memory had sustained her through years of danger and isolation. Sarah Chen was 17 years old when she died, Emma told the gathered mourners. She was just a teenager who worked at a diner and played soccer and worried about chemistry tests. But she was also someone who believed that right and wrong mattered more than safety and comfort. She died because she refused to let evil people hide their crimes behind badges and titles. Emma's words captured something essential about Sarah's legacy. She hadn't been a trained investigator or a professional journalist, but an ordinary young person who had chosen extraordinary courage when confronted with corruption and injustice. But Sarah's story doesn't end with her burial. In the years since her murder, her case has become a touchstone for criminal justice reform and anti-corruption efforts across the United States. The Sarah Chen Foundation, established by her parents in 2022, provides support for families of crime victims and funding for organizations working to combat government corruption. The foundation has helped dozens of families navigate the justice system and has contributed to legislation strengthening witness protection programs. Emma Rodriguez, after years of living in fear and isolation, eventually became a prosecutor herself, specializing in public corruption cases. Sarah's death taught me that ordinary people have to be willing to stand up to powerful criminals, Emma explains. If we leave it to the system to police itself, innocent people will keep dying. Emma's career has been dedicated to cases similar to Sarah's. Situations where government officials abuse their power to protect criminal enterprises. She has secured convictions against dozens of corrupt officials and has never lost sight of the teenage friend whose courage inspired her career. Detective Raymond Morrison, vindicated by the federal investigation, returned to law enforcement and eventually rose to become chief of police in a neighboring county. His department is known for its transparency and community oversight, reforms inspired directly by his experience with the Millbrook corruption network. Sarah Chen changed how I think about police work. Chief Morrison reflects. She showed me that our real job isn't just catching criminals. It's making sure that citizens can trust the people who carry badges. The Millbrook Sheriff's Department was completely restructured following the convictions, with new leadership and oversight procedures designed to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had protected Sarah's killers. The Peterson farm was purchased by the county and converted into a community center, a transformation that symbolically reclaimed the site of so much evil for positive community use. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah's case led to federal legislation strengthening penalties for law enforcement corruption and improving protections for witnesses who expose government wrongdoing. The Sarah Chen Act, passed in 2003, created new oversight mechanisms for witness protection programs and established mandatory federal investigation of any case where local law enforcement is suspected of covering up serious crimes. Today, 28 years after that terrifying phone call from Murphy's gas station, Sarah Chen's legacy lives on in the lives she has saved and the reforms her sacrifice inspired. The payphone where she made her final call has long since been removed, but the courage she demonstrated in those last moments continues to inspire people facing similar choices between safety and justice. Emma Rodriguez, now a mother of two, makes annual pilgrimages to Sarah's grave on September 15th, the anniversary of her disappearance. She brings flowers and sits quietly, sometimes speaking aloud to the friend whose voice she can still hear across the years. I tell her about the cases we've won, the corrupt officials we've convicted, the families who got justice, because of the changes her death inspired, Emma says. I want her to know that her sacrifice mattered, that the truth she died protecting has made the world a little bit safer for people like us. The last payphone call Sarah Chen ever made lasted only 3 minutes and 27 seconds. But the courage she demonstrated in those brief moments, choosing to expose the truth even when it meant facing death, continues to echo through the justice system and the lives of everyone who refuses to let powerful people commit crimes in the shadows. Sarah Chen was 17 years old when she died. She had dreams of college, career, family, all the futures that were stolen from her by corrupt officials who thought they were above the law. But in choosing truth over safety, justice over silence, she achieved something that her killers never could. A legacy that will outlive them all. Her voice, carried across the years, through the courage of those who refuse to let her story be forgotten, reminds us that sometimes the most important calls we make are the ones that cost us everything and change everything. Thank you for joining us for this season of Buried Secrets. Sarah Chen's story is one of tragedy, but also of hope, proof that even when the system fails, truth has a way of surfacing, and justice, though delayed, can still be served. If you or someone you know has information about government corruption or unsolved crimes, remember Sarah's courage and speak up. Your voice might be the one that brings a killer to justice or saves an innocent life. Until next time, keep searching for the truth, no matter how deeply it's buried. This has been Buried Secrets. I'm your host, and Sarah Chen's story will stay with me forever.
Welcome to Horror Out.